Hello and welcome to the Maritime Impact Podcast. I'm your host Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. In this episode, we examine recent developments in the United Kingdom, focusing on the UK emissions trading system, also known as the UK ETS. We hope you enjoy this episode. And now, on to the show. Before addressing the UK, a brief update on the EU. Following the one-year adjournment of the IMO Net Zero Framework adoption, the European Commission is still evaluating outcomes and has not yet communicated a clear alternative strategy. I had hoped to be able to share some insights from the thinking in Brussels, but unfortunately the Commission is pretty tight-lipped for the time being. For now, I think we may very well be at MEPC 84 before we get any clear indications on whether a Plan B is evolving, and if so, what it may look like. What I can say with some confidence is that the scheduled review of the EU ETS will happen according to plan, and that the recent and potential IMO developments no doubt will be taken into account. But to speak plainly, I do not expect any kind of efforts towards softening, aligning, or even mothballing the ETS to be on the table before we know what happens with the IMO and ZF. And speaking of the EU ETS, that brings us to the topic of the day, the UK ETS. From a high-level perspective, you may think of this as a post-Brexit bonus, where the UK is essentially still replacing EU legislation with UK legislation. In an ideal world, these would of course be aligned, if not identical, but as I trust everyone is aware, we're not living in an ideal world. More on that later. As a bit of history, you may recall that back in 2024, the UK made the decision to roll shipping into the existing UK ETS system, but with modifications taking into account the nature of shipping. Many small mobile emitters compared to the ETS baseline design, which is really about fewer, larger and stationary emitters. The intent was to have this become effective from 1st of January 2026, and indicative design features were published in a formal consultation for interested parties to respond to. Now, after a bit of toing and froing, and a process that has taken longer than expected, His Majesty's government has finally made decisions on what it intends to do and when it intends to do it. First and foremost, shipping will be included in the UK ETS from 1st of July 2026. So the timeline has slipped a bit compared with what was envisaged earlier in 2025, but it really is just around the corner. Ships to be covered are cargo and passenger vessels of 5,000 GT and above, and offshore vessels are to be included from 1st of January 2027. So here there is a bit of alignment with the EU ETS going on. Surrendering of allowances that have been acquired through auctions or in the market is of course a key feature, but note that the UK market is distinct and separate from the EU market. So-called EU allowances, EUAs, and UK allowances, UKAs, are not interchangeable, at least not for now. And in about to practical thinking, the UK has decided that the first surrender deadline will be 30th of April 2028, covering both 2026 and 2027 emissions. The so-called Manage Your Emissions Trading Scheme, METS, system and the UK Emissions Trading Registry are going to be new entities for the maritime industry to become familiar with, as these are where the practicalities are going to be managed. So what activities are covered? The intent is to initially cover domestic journeys, defined as a journey starting and finishing at a port located in the UK. Those engaging in international shipping may therefore give a sigh of relief, thinking that they are off the hook, but they would be wrong to do so. The reason is that emissions in ports are included irrespective of the ship engaging in domestic or international voyages. So while those engaging solely in international voyages may not face very high UK ETS costs, they will still need to engage in all required administrative activities. There are also some bells and whistles added when it comes to Northern Ireland. Voyages to and from Great Britain get a 50% deduction to avoid disparities with Ireland itself, And there are exemptions for ferry services to Scottish islands as well as for certain ship types. Initially, the substances covered are the same as under the EU ETS, CO2, CH4 and N2O, and all are being considered in a tank-to-wake perspective. But be aware that the UK is still mulling over a potential shift to well-to-wake at a later stage. Personally, I do not see this change as being very likely in the next few years, but one never knows what the future holds. Especially if the IMO fails to agree on the NZF, we expect to see a generally increased appetite for creating and tightening regional and national greenhouse gas regulations. And finally, who is responsible and how will compliance be ascertained? Fortunately, also here the UK has decided to align with what the EU has already done and has decided to make the registered owner responsible, except if the ISM company has been formally delegated. A difference from the EU approach is that the UK will not require a document of compliance to be held on board. Instead, compliance will be managed through the UK METS system and the ETS registry system I just mentioned. So is that all of it? Not quite, I'm afraid. While the development of the UK ETS has been winding through the bureaucracy, there have been other more political processes ongoing. As I mentioned back in July, the EU and UK has reached a so-called common understanding, which includes agreement on aligning the EU ETS and the UK ETS. That would also include aligning the requirements applying to shipping. The exact details of what alignment actually means, however, are subject to negotiations, and these negotiations are only expected to really get underway sometime in 2026, with no expected end date yet defined. The UK has stated that as part of this alignment, there is an intent to also include emissions from international voyages, provisionally starting in 2028. This, of course, is real alignment with the EU requirements. And if the 2028 date is to be taken as a real signal, I would suggest that it in reality signifies a UK desire to have alignment negotiations concluded to allow full alignment from 2028. I would suspect that this is an acceptable target date as seen from Brussels as well. In that sense, UK shipping is facing repeated changes over the next few years. As I discussed in the pod back in July, we will first get a rollout of the UK ETS as a standalone regulation, and then at some point, maybe in 2028, alignment between the EU and UK. The negotiations on alignment may also be complicated somewhat by the EU review of the ETS, which will be ongoing in parallel with the EU-UK political negotiations. So in practice, this might also mean that the EU ETS will go through two sets of closely paced changes, first one based on the EU review and then one taking into account the negotiated outcome. It all looks a bit messy process-wise, with the potential for multiple changes happening over a short time frame, and we can only hope that the process issues don't spill over into the requirements themselves. So, to the key takeaways. The UK ETS will kick in from 1st of July 2026. While designed as a system for domestic shipping, it will also have implications for international shipping. At the outset, the UK ETS will be completely separate from the EU ETS, but this will change, possibly from 1st of January 2028. The overlapping revision and alignment processes imply that ships operating under the EU and UK ETS may face multiple changes over the next few years, so it's therefore important to keep an eye on how both of these regulations evolve. In DNV, we will of course be doing the same. You've been listening to the Maritime Impact podcast from DNV with me, Eirik Nyhus. We'll be back with one more episode this season to look at methanol, one of the key alternative fuel options for shipping. With more than 450 methanol-capable vessels already in operation or on order, it's an opportunity worth understanding. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating or review. Thank you for listening.